For one quiet hour, nothing looked wrong. And that's exactly why this case still terrifies investigators. It was a normal morning. No screaming, no neighbors calling for help, no broken doors, no warning signs that would later make sense. The house stood still, exactly as it had on countless other days. Inside, children followed their routines. Outside, the world moved on, unaware that anything unusual was happening. And that is what unsettles investigators to this day. Because when police later tried to reconstruct what happened, they found no chaos to follow, no emotional explosion, no desperate attempt to escape. What they found instead was calm, deliberate actions, and a sequence of decisions that only makes sense if the mind behind them was no longer anchored to reality. This is not a story about sudden violence. It is a story about deterioration that went unnoticed, about how illness can wear the mask of normalcy, and about how sometimes the most disturbing crimes do not announce themselves at all. Tonight, we're not here to sensationalize. We're here to understand, to examine how an ordinary hour became the most important hour of an investigation, and why even decades later, this case still refuses to offer easy answers. In the early years of the 21st century, suburban Texas projected a familiar image of stability. Rows of single-family homes stretched along quiet streets. Lawns were trimmed, driveways filled in the early evening, emptied again in the morning. It was the kind of environment designed to signal safety, predictability, and routine. On paper, nothing appears unusual. The community where the Yates family lived fit comfortably within this landscape. It was neither affluent nor struggling, neither isolated nor chaotic. It reflected a version of middle-class America that many people recognize instinctively, a place where daily life followed patterns and where serious disruption was assumed to be rare. From the outside, the household blends into its surroundings. The Yates home functioned around structure. Days were organized by meals, childcare errands, and church-related activities. The children were central to the family's identity, not as an abstract ideal, but as a practical, everyday reality. Their presence shaped schedules, priorities, and decisions. Like many families with young children, life revolved around managing time, energy, and responsibility. To neighbors and acquaintances, this was not a household that stood out. There were no frequent emergency visits, no visible domestic disturbances, no police presence that might have drawn attention. In retrospect, this absence of visible crisis becomes one of the most important features of the case, not because it conceals something dramatic, but because it illustrates how psychological collapse can exist alongside apparent order. This is where many people misunderstand cases like this one. There is a common assumption that extreme outcomes must be preceded by extreme signals, public breakdowns, obvious instability, or escalating conflict. But many severe psychological conditions do not announce themselves in this way. They progress quietly, adapting to the rhythms of daily life, rather than interrupting them. Stability can coexist with vulnerability. The Yates household also operated within a religious framework that on the surface appeared conventional. Faith was part of daily life, but not in a way that immediately marked the family as radical or isolated. Church attendance, religious discussion, and moral structure were common elements in many American households at the time. To an outside observer, nothing about this environment would have raised immediate concern. Importantly, belief systems do not function in isolation from mental health. They interact with it, but in this early stage of the story, there is no clear boundary where belief becomes pathology. There is only continuity. The same routines, the same values repeated day after day. The children themselves were not presented as symbols or abstractions within the family. They were individuals with schedules, needs, and roles within the household. Their presence anchored daily life. In many ways, they represented purpose and meaning, reinforcing the sense that this was of a family oriented toward care and responsibility. This is not incidental. Families structured around caregiving often develop a strong outward appearance of coherence. Responsibilities are met. Tasks are completed. The system appears to function, and because of that, deeper vulnerabilities can remain unseen not only by outsiders, but sometimes by the people living within the system themselves. When we examine this case now, it is tempting to search backward for obvious warning signs, to imagine that there must have been moments when everything clearly began to fall apart. But the record does not support that narrative. Instead, it suggests something quieter. A household that continued to operate. A community that continued to assume normalcy. A life that until the moment it entered the public record looked unremarkable. This is why the setting matters. Not because it hides a secret villain or an unseen threat, but because it reminds us that severe psychological deterioration does not require visible disorder. It can unfold within routines, within faith, within responsibility, in plain sight without spectacle. And that is precisely what makes this case worth examining carefully, not for shock, not for fear, but for what it reveals about how fragile normalcy can be, even when everything appears on the surface to be holding together. Before going any further, it is important to clarify what this analysis is and what it is not. This is not an exercise in assigning blame. It is not an attempt to reenact violence, reconstruct suffering, or provoke emotional shock. And it is not a search for a villain that can neatly absorb responsibility. This case continues to be examined by psychologists, legal scholars, and investigators, not because it offers dramatic revelations, but because it sits at a difficult intersection where mental illness, criminal law, and ethical judgment collide without clear boundaries. At the center of that intersection is Andrea Yates, but the significance of the case extends far beyond one individual. It forces institutions and audiences alike to confront uncomfortable questions. How do we evaluate responsibility when reality itself has fractured? At what point does illness override intent? And how do systems designed for clarity respond when clarity is impossible? One reason this case remains relevant is the persistent misunderstanding of postpartum psychiatric disorders. Conditions such as postpartum psychosis are rare, but when they occur, their severity is often underestimated. Public discourse tends to collapse all postpartum conditions into a single category, flattening crucial distinctions between depression, anxiety, and psychotic breaks. From a psychological standpoint, this matters. Postpartum psychosis does not merely amplify sadness or stress. It can dismantle reality testing entirely. Individuals experiencing it may operate under belief systems that feel internally coherent, but bear little relationship to the external world. In such states, moral reasoning can become rigid, absolute, and detached from consequence. Yet criminal law is not designed to measure internal coherence. It is designed to assess intent, action, and accountability. This creates a tension that is not easily resolved. Legal systems require lines. Mental illness often erases them. As a result, this case has become a reference point in debates about the ethical limits of responsibility, not because it provides definitive answers, but because it exposes the inadequacy of simple ones. The verdicts, the appeals, and the institutional responses all reflect attempts to reconcile two competing frameworks, one grounded in legal responsibility, the other in clinical reality. To engage with this case responsibly, we must also establish clear analytical boundaries. There are things we know. We have medical records, court transcripts, and documented timelines. We have professional diagnoses made by trained clinicians. We have observable behavior before, during, and after the event. These elements form the factual backbone of the case. But there are also things we do not know. We do not have access to private thoughts. We do not know how specific beliefs were experienced internally at specific moments. We cannot reconstruct the precise sequence of cognitive distortions as they unfolded, and we cannot retroactively observe moments that were never recorded. The record allows us to see patterns, but not motives. This distinction is critical. Pattern recognition allows us to analyze deterioration, consistency, and deviation. Motive, however, belongs to internal experience, and internal experience leaves only indirect traces. Throughout this analysis, inference will be used carefully and transparently. Observations will be grounded in behavior context and established psychological research. When interpretation moves beyond confirmed fact, it will be framed as possibility, not conclusion. Understanding is not the same as justification. To understand how a psychological collapse unfolded is not to excuse its outcome. Likewise, to acknowledge systemic limitations is not to deny personal tragedy. These ideas can coexist, and in cases like this one, they must. Finally, this case deserves careful analysis because it resists narrative closure. It does not resolve into a clean moral lesson or a singular point of failure. Instead, it reveals how multiple systems, family medicine, belief, and law can function as intended and still fail to prevent catastrophe. Not through malice, not through neglect alone, but through the quiet accumulation of limits. This is why the case continues to matter, and why it must be approached with patience, restraint, and intellectual honesty, not to relive what happened, but to understand how something so devastating could unfold without ever appearing extraordinary until it was already too late. Long before this case entered public awareness, there was already a record forming not of criminal intent, but of repeated psychological distress. The timeline prior to the event is not marked by a single crisis. Instead, it is defined by recurrence, interruption, and return. Medical documentation shows that Andrea Yates experienced serious psychiatric symptoms years before the incident that would later define her name in headlines. These were not vague or ambiguous complaints. They included documented episodes of severe depression, suicidal ideation, and periods of cognitive disturbance significant enough to require hospitalization. At multiple points, intervention occurred. She was admitted to psychiatric facilities. She was evaluated by clinicians. Diagnoses were made. Medications were prescribed. Each of these moments suggests recognition, an acknowledgement that something was wrong and required professional attention. But the pattern that emerges is not one of sustained stabilization. Treatment appears episodic rather than continuous. Care intensified during moments of acute crisis, then receded once immediate danger seemed to pass. Hospital stays ended. Medications were adjusted or discontinued. Life resumed its routines. The system responded to emergencies but struggled to manage the long arc of chronic illness. From a psychological perspective, this distinction matters. Chronic psychiatric conditions often do not resolve cleanly. They fluctuate. Symptoms recede, then return in altered forms. When intervention focuses primarily on crisis containment, it may leave underlying vulnerabilities intact. Stability in these cases can be provisional rather than durable. Family responses followed a similar rhythm. Support was present. There were attempts to manage symptoms, adjust routines, and seek help when warning signs became unmistakable. But these responses were frequently reactive rather than anticipatory. Decisions were made in response to visible deterioration, not in anticipation of it. Over time, this can subtly shift perception. Repeated crises can recalibrate expectations. What once appeared alarming may begin to feel familiar. Behaviors that would have raised immediate concern early on can, through repetition, become part of the background noise of daily life. This does not imply indifference. It suggests adaptation, a human tendency to normalize what persists. It may indicate accommodation rather than resolution. From the outside, this normalization can be difficult to detect. The household continued to function. Children were cared for. Daily responsibilities were met. There was no clear moment when order collapsed. Instead, illness was folded into routine managed alongside other demands. Institutional systems reflected similar constraints. Mental health care at the time relied heavily on short-term inpatient treatment and outpatient follow-up that depended on compliance access and ongoing assessment. There were limits to monitoring, there were gaps between evaluations, and there were few mechanisms to account for how rapidly certain conditions, particularly postpartum psychiatric disorders, can escalate. What stands out in hindsight is not neglect but fragmentation. Medical professionals addressed symptoms within their scope. Family members responded within theirs. Legal structures remained distant because no crime had occurred. Each system operated according to its design, but none were positioned to oversee the entire trajectory. This is where early behavioral analysis becomes relevant. There is no evidence in the period leading up to the event of planning or concealment. There are no indications of escalating aggression toward others. What does appear consistently is internal distress directed inward, managed through clinical intervention, and temporarily stabilized before resurfacing. The absence of sirens is not the absence of warning. It is the presence of signals that do not demand immediate action, even as they accumulate. Signals that suggest vulnerability without pointing toward a specific outcome. Signals that in isolation might seem manageable, but together form a pattern of increasing risk. When examining this stage of the timeline, it is important to resist hindsight bias. Knowing the outcome makes earlier moments appear more ominous than they may have felt at the time. For the people involved were responding to what they could see with the tools they had. The record allows us to trace this progression, but it does not grant foresight. What it offers instead is a portrait of how severe psychological illness can persist within structured lives, how systems can respond appropriately and still fall short, and how a lack of visible chaos does not equate to safety. This is not the calm before a storm in a dramatic sense. It is a continuation, steady, unresolved, and quietly fragile. And it sets the stage for everything that follows. When the timeline reaches the central hour of this case, the available information narrows significantly. There are no independent witnesses inside the home. There is no continuous recording. What remains is a sequence reconstructed later through statements, calls, and official reports. For analytical purposes, it is important to describe this window in restrained factual terms. The period in question lasted approximately 1 hour. During that time, Andrea Yates was alone in the house with her children. There is no evidence of interruption from outside sources, no calls placed mid-event, no attempts to seek assistance during the sequence itself. What matters here is not the mechanics of what occurred, but the structure of time. The actions were not instantaneous. They unfolded across a defined duration. That duration implies opportunity to stop, to change course, to act differently. Yet the sequence continued to completion. From a behavioral standpoint, this suggests not impulsivity in the conventional sense, but follow-through. This distinction is critical. Impulsive acts are typically characterized by immediacy, emotional overflow, and subsequent disorganization. They often leave behind evidence of panic, erratic movement. Inconsistent behavior attempts to undo or obscure what has occurred. None of those markers appear prominently here. Immediately after the event, Andrea Yates contacted authorities. She also contacted her husband. These actions occurred without delay. There was no attempt to leave the residence. No effort to conceal the situation. No behavior consistent with evasion. This behavior does not resemble concealment. From a criminal analysis perspective, absence of flight is not neutral. It carries interpretive weight. Individuals who perceive their actions as criminal often attempt to distance themselves, physically or narratively, from the scene. They may delay contact with authorities, seek alibis, or attempt partial disclosure. None of that is evident here. Instead, the post-event behavior appears direct and procedural. Calls were made. Information was provided. The sequence moved quickly into the domain of law enforcement and emergency response. This transition was not resisted. It suggests internal coherence rather than panic. That coherence does not imply rationality in a normative sense. Rather, it suggests that the actions aligned with an internal belief system that did not frame them as wrongdoing. In psychological terms, this is often associated with psychotic states, where behavior follows a distorted but internally consistent logic. Importantly, this interpretation must remain cautious. We cannot access Andrea Yates's subjective experience in that moment. We do not know the precise thoughts that accompanied each decision. What we can analyze is behavior, and behavior alone suggests an absence of perceived criminality at the time. This is consistent with documented features of psychotic belief systems. In such states, individuals may act with deliberation, not because they are calculating outcomes in a legal sense, but because they are following what feels like a moral or necessary directive. The emotional tone is often flattened or focused rather than chaotic. The aftermath reinforces this pattern. When law enforcement arrived, there was no reported resistance, no attempt to minimize involvement, no narrative manipulation. These are not definitive indicators of mental state, but they align with a broader behavioral profile, one in which the individual does not experience the need to hide. From an investigative standpoint, this creates a different set of challenges. Cases involving concealment invite reconstruction through deception analysis. Cases like this one offer no such structure. The lack of evasion removes certain interpretive tools while amplifying others, particularly clinical evaluation. It is also worth noting what did not occur. There is no evidence of self-harm or attempted self-harm immediately following the event. No immediate collapse, no outward emotional release. This absence complicates simplistic assumptions about guilt, remorse, or realization. Emotional responses, when they occur later, do not necessarily reflect awareness at the time. Here again, restraint matters. The record allows us to map actions and timing. It allows us to identify behavioral markers that diverge from typical criminal patterns. What it does not allow is certainty about inner experience. What can be said is limited but significant. The sequence before, during, and immediately after the event forms a coherent behavioral arc, one that does not resemble panic, concealment, or escape, but rather continuity. In the context of this case, that continuity is one of the most revealing elements of the timeline, not because it explains what happened in moral terms, but because it suggests how a fractured perception of reality can guide behavior with unsettling consistency, and it marks the moment when a private psychological collapse became an irreversible public event. To understand this case at a psychological level, it is necessary to separate illness from identity, while also recognizing how tightly the two can become intertwined. This is not an easy distinction to maintain, but it is an essential one. Andrea Yates was not defined solely by her diagnosis. She was a mother, a spouse, and a person whose sense of self was deeply shaped by responsibility, morality, and belief. When severe mental illness entered that framework, it did not replace those elements. It interacted with them. The diagnosis most often associated with this case is postpartum psychosis. It is important to explain what that means and what it does not. Postpartum psychosis is not an intensified form of postpartum depression. While depression is characterized by low mood, hopelessness, and withdrawal, psychosis involves a break from shared reality. Individuals may experience delusions, hallucinations, or rigid belief systems that are immune to contradiction. Reality testing, the ability to evaluate whether a thought corresponds to the external world, becomes compromised. This loss of reality testing is central. When reality testing erodes, beliefs are no longer checked against consequence. They become self-reinforcing. In this state, reasoning can remain structured and consistent, even as it becomes profoundly disconnected from external norms. This is where moral absolutism often emerges. In Andrea Yates's case, available records suggest a belief-driven framework that became increasingly rigid. Moral concepts were not flexible or contextual. They appear to have been interpreted in absolute terms: right versus wrong, salvation versus condemnation, duty versus failure. One possible interpretation is that this rigidity provided psychological structure at a time when internal coherence was otherwise collapsing. Belief systems can function as scaffolding. For someone experiencing cognitive fragmentation, they offer clarity and certainty. However, when filtered through psychosis, those same beliefs can become distorted into imperatives no longer symbolic or guiding, but literal and compulsory. It may suggest that Andrea's actions were not experienced internally as choices among alternatives, but as compliance with a perceived moral necessity. This distinction matters. From the outside, behavior can appear deliberate and organized. From the inside, it may feel inevitable. Psychosis does not always manifest as confusion or chaos. In many cases, it produces a narrowed focus where attention is directed toward a single perceived problem and its perceived solution. Importantly, acknowledging this internal logic does not mean endorsing it. The challenge for analysts is to describe belief-driven reasoning without validating the conclusions it produces. Andrea's internal framework, as inferred from behavior and later statements, appears to have been guided by fixed moral conclusions. Once those conclusions were reached, alternative interpretations may no longer have been cognitively accessible. At the same time, we must recognize the limits of what can be known. We do not have direct access to Andrea Yates's internal experience at the precise moments in question. We cannot observe her thoughts as they formed, conflicted, or resolved. What remains is behavioral residue, actions taken, words spoken afterward, and patterns documented over time. From that residue, we can infer tendencies, not certainties. It may indicate that her identity as a mother, combined with severe mental illness, produced a narrowing of moral reasoning rather than its absence. Responsibility did not disappear. It became distorted. This is a critical point. In many popular narratives, mental illness is framed as a loss of care or concern. In reality, severe disorders often warp existing values instead of erasing them. Care becomes overdetermined. Responsibility becomes absolute. Doubt disappears. The resulting behavior can appear purposeful, even as it is profoundly disconnected from shared reality. Throughout this analysis, restraint remains essential. Any attempt to fully explain internal motivation risks overreach. What can be said with caution is that Andrea Yates's psychological state appears to have involved a convergence of illness and identity, where belief, duty, and distorted perception reinforced one another. Mental illness rarely operates in isolation. In this case, it interacted with a deeply held moral framework, producing behavior that was internally consistent but externally catastrophic. Understanding that interaction does not resolve the tragedy, but it does allow us to move beyond caricature and toward a more accurate, if unsettling, picture of how severe psychological collapse can manifest. Not as chaos, but as certainty in the absence of reality. While Andrea Yates remains the central figure in this case, her psychological state did not exist in isolation. It developed within a network of relationships, belief systems, and institutional responses, each exerting its own form of pressure, often unintentionally. Family members were the closest witnesses to her deterioration, and their role is among the most difficult to analyze. Support was present. There were efforts to manage symptoms, seek treatment, and maintain stability. Yet support and understanding are not synonymous. Living alongside chronic mental illness produces emotional fatigue. Repeated crises require repeated decisions. Evade hospitalizations disrupt routines. Temporary improvements raise hope only to be followed by relapse. Over time, caregivers may begin to measure stability, not by wellness, but by the absence of immediate danger. This shift is subtle, and it is human. It may indicate not neglect, but exhaustion. Family members often face conflicting responsibilities, protecting children, supporting a partner, maintaining economic stability, and trusting professional guidance. When improvement appears even briefly, there is a natural tendency to accept it as progress rather than pause to question its durability. Misunderstanding does not necessarily stem from ignorance. It often stems from proximity. When abnormal behavior becomes familiar, it risks being interpreted as manageable rather than escalating. This is one way normalization takes hold, not through denial, but through adaptation. Overlaying this family dynamic was the presence of rigid belief frameworks. Andrea had contact with a preacher whose teachings emphasized absolute moral judgment and eternal consequence. Michael Warren-Yecke. His ideology framed parental responsibility in extreme terms, portraying moral failure as irreversible and catastrophic. It is crucial to be precise here. Belief systems do not cause psychosis. However, when psychosis is present, rigid ideologies can function as accelerants. They provide content to delusions and structure to distorted reasoning. In a mind already struggling to test reality, absolutist beliefs can become fixed reference points immune to doubt. This interaction matters more than the belief itself. Psychosis often seeks certainty. Extremist frameworks offer it. They divide the world cleanly into right and wrong, saved and condemned. When combined with moral rigidity and identity centered on responsibility, such frameworks can intensify cognitive narrowing. It may suggest that belief did not initiate collapse, but shaped its direction. Beyond family and belief systems, professional actors played a critical role, though their influence was limited by the structures within which they operated. Clinicians encountered Andrea through episodic contact, hospital admissions, evaluations, medication management. Their focus was necessarily on acute symptoms, suicidality, psychosis, immediate risk. Once those symptoms appeared to stabilize, responsibility shifted back to outpatient care and family oversight. This is not a failure of individual clinicians. It reflects systemic design. Mental health protocols prioritize crisis intervention. They are less equipped to manage long-term trajectories that fluctuate unpredictably. Compliance, insight, and environmental stability are assumed once discharge occurs, even when underlying vulnerabilities persist. The legal system, meanwhile, remained largely peripheral until after the event. Law enforcement and courts respond to defined actions, not emerging risk. Prior to the incident, there was no legal mechanism to intervene further. No crime had occurred. No statutory threshold had been crossed. Legal definitions require clarity. Mental illness often erodes it. After the event, the legal system faced a different constraint. How to evaluate responsibility when intent and perception diverge. Insanity defenses rely on narrow criteria applied retrospectively under intense public scrutiny. The system is designed to resolve cases, not to accommodate ambiguity indefinitely. This leads to the central analytical insight of this chapter. Systems respond to symptoms, not trajectories. Families respond to what they can see. Clinicians respond to what presents clinically. Legal institutions respond to actions that meet defined thresholds. No single system is positioned to oversee the full arc of psychological decline as it unfolds across years. Each response taken alone may appear reasonable. Together they reveal gaps not of concern, but of continuity. Understanding this ecosystem does not distribute blame. It clarifies pressure. Andrea Yates's psychological collapse was shaped by interaction illness, intersecting with belief, responsibility, intersecting with fatigue and care, intersecting with systemic limits. No single influence explains the outcome, but together they form a context in which deterioration could progress without triggering decisive intervention. Mental illness rarely operates alone. It moves through relationships. It absorbs language from belief. It tests the edges of institutions designed for stability. And when those forces align in the wrong moment, the result can be devastating, not because anyone intended harm, but because no system was designed to see the whole picture at once. Every investigation produces a record, and every record, no matter how thorough, contains silences. In this case, the silences are not accidental. They are structural. They exist because no system, medical, legal, or familial, is designed to capture the full interior life of a person over time. What remains, therefore, is a collection of documents that describe actions, diagnoses, and outcomes, but leave entire stretches of lived experience unrecorded. The record is silent on countless conversations. We do not have transcripts of private exchanges inside the home. We do not know the precise language used during moments of concern, reassurance, or disagreement. We cannot hear the tone of voice, the pauses, or the hesitations that often carry as much meaning as words themselves. These conversations occurred outside institutional settings beyond the reach of documentation. This absence matters because meaning is often negotiated privately. Beliefs evolve in dialogue. Doubts surface in moments of trust. When those moments go unrecorded, the trajectory of thought becomes difficult to trace. The record is also silent on private thoughts. Medical notes capture symptoms as reported or observed, not the continuous flow of cognition between appointments. Delusions, fears, and moral reasoning may intensify or recede in ways that never reach clinical attention. There is no reliable method to document internal deliberation as it unfolds in real time. We cannot reconstruct internal deliberation. This limitation is not unique to this case. It is a fundamental boundary of psychological investigation. Even the most detailed evaluations are snapshots taken at specific moments, under specific conditions. They do not capture what happens between visits during nights of insomnia, or in quiet hours when beliefs consolidate without external challenge. Moments between clinical evaluations are particularly significant. Appointments are separated by days, weeks, or months. During those intervals, responsibility shifts to families and individuals. Symptoms may fluctuate. Medications may feel effective or intolerable. New interpretations may form. None of this is continuously monitored. The system assumes stability, unless presented with evidence to the contrary. Absence is not neutrality. When nothing is recorded, it does not mean nothing occurred. It means that what occurred did not intersect with a mechanism designed to observe it. This distinction is critical. Silence in the record reflects the boundaries of observation, not the absence of experience. From an analytical perspective, these gaps resist narrative closure. They prevent definitive statements about intent awareness or progression. This can be frustrating for investigators, for scholars, and for the public. But it is also a form of protection against overreach. Speculation thrives in silence. Responsible analysis does not. The temptation when faced with missing information is to fill it, to imagine decisive conversations that never happened, or moments of clarity that were missed. But doing so risks imposing coherence where none can be verified. It replaces uncertainty with assumption. The discipline of analysis requires restraint. The record allows us to identify patterns, repeated hospitalizations, documented diagnoses, observable behavior before and after critical moments. What it does not allow is a continuous psychological narrative that explains how one thought led inevitably to another. This absence has ethical implications. When internal experience cannot be reconstructed, conclusions about motive must remain provisional. Language must remain conditional. Interpretation must remain bounded. This is not a weakness of analysis, it is its integrity. Silence also reveals how systems are designed. Medical systems document symptoms that meet criteria. Legal systems document actions that meet thresholds. Family systems document only what they can perceive and remember. No system is tasked with preserving ambiguity or tracking gradual cognitive drift. What falls between those systems becomes invisible. In this sense, the gaps in the record are not failures. They are reminders of scope. They show us where responsibility ends and uncertainty begins. They caution against narratives that promise full understanding when none is possible. As this chapter unfolds, these silences will remain present, not as mysteries to be solved, but as boundaries to be respected. Because in cases like this, what we do not know is not incidental. It is part of the truth. To understand why this case unfolded as it did, it is necessary to examine not individual decisions, but the structures within which those decisions were made. The medical and legal systems involved were not indifferent or inactive. They were constrained by design, by policy, and by the limits of what they are built to do. In the early 2000s, mental health care in the United States operated under significant structural pressure. Treatment was increasingly shaped by insurance models that prioritized short-term stabilization over long-term management. Inpatient psychiatric care in particular was designed to address immediate risk rather than sustained vulnerability. Hospitalization was often brief. Patients were admitted during acute crises when suicidal ideation, psychosis, or severe impairment became unmistakable. Once symptoms appeared to improve, discharge followed. The assumption was not that illness had resolved, but that it had become manageable in an outpatient setting. Ongoing care depended on follow-up appointments, medication compliance, and environmental stability. This approach reflects a practical compromise. Mental health systems are designed to respond to volume and urgency. They cannot provide continuous observation for individuals whose conditions fluctuate unpredictably over months or years. As a result, care becomes episodic. Intervention occurs at peaks, not along the entire trajectory. Insurance structures reinforced this model. Coverage often limited the duration of inpatient stays. Extended hospitalization required justification tied to immediate danger, not long-term risk. Once that threshold was no longer met, treatment shifted outward, placing greater responsibility on families and patients themselves. This does not imply negligence. It reflects a system optimized for crisis containment, not longitudinal oversight. The gap between those two goals is where many cases become vulnerable. The legal system operates under a different but equally restrictive set of constraints. Criminal law requires defined categories and clear thresholds. Mental illness enters the legal framework primarily through the concept of competence and, in rare cases, insanity. These categories are intentionally narrow. They are designed to preserve accountability while allowing limited exceptions when reality testing is demonstrably impaired. Insanity as a legal standard is not a diagnosis. It is a legal conclusion reached through retrospective evaluation. This creates inherent difficulty. Psychiatric assessments after an event rely on records, interviews, and observed behavior. They attempt to reconstruct mental state at a specific moment in the past. But memory is imperfect. Accounts are influenced by outcome, and internal experience cannot be directly observed. Retrospective evaluation challenges are not flaws in the process. They are unavoidable constraints. Courts must reach decisions. They cannot remain indefinitely uncertain. Yet mental illness does not conform to legal timelines. Symptoms evolve. Insight fluctuates. Awareness may emerge only after the fact, complicating judgments about responsibility at the time of the act. In cases involving severe psychiatric disorders, this tension becomes especially pronounced. The law asks whether an individual knew right from wrong. Psychology asks how reality itself was perceived. These questions overlap, but they are not identical. Bridging them requires interpretation, and interpretation carries uncertainty. What emerges from this analysis is not a picture of failure, but of misalignment. Medical systems responded to symptoms as they presented. Legal systems responded to actions once they occurred. Neither was structured to intervene decisively in the gray space between emerging risk and defined crisis. This is the key insight of this chapter. Cases like this do not remain unresolved or become ethically complex because institutions are indifferent. They do so because institutions are designed with limits. Those limits protect against overreach, but they also create blind spots. Understanding these constraints does not absolve outcomes. It contextualizes them. It reminds us that systems built for clarity struggle when faced with gradual deterioration, that frameworks designed for decisiveness falter in the presence of ambiguity, and that when mental illness unfolds slowly across domains, it can exceed the capacity of any single structure to contain it. This is not an indictment. It is an explanation, one that helps us understand why even with intervention, documentation, and legal process, some cases resist clean resolution. Not because no one acted, but because no system was designed to see the whole picture at once. After moving through timelines, psychological frameworks, and institutional limits, it becomes necessary to pause and take stock of what this case actually allows us to say with confidence, and where analysis must deliberately stop. True crime analysis often fails at this stage. The pressure to conclude, to explain fully, or to extract a final lesson can override intellectual restraint. In this case, restraint is not only appropriate, it is essential. There are facts that are firmly established. Medical records confirm that Andrea Yates experienced severe and recurrent psychiatric illness over a prolonged period. These were not isolated episodes. They included documented depression, suicidal ideation, and psychotic symptoms serious enough to require hospitalization on multiple occasions. The pattern was one of deterioration, punctuated by temporary stabilization. This is not speculative. This is what the evidence supports. There is also a clear record of treatment medication, inpatient care, and clinical evaluation applied within the norms of the mental health system at the time. The care was real, but it was episodic. Intervention responded to acute symptoms, not to long-term trajectory. Behaviorally, the timeline surrounding the event shows consistency rather than volatility. Actions before and after do not resemble panic, concealment, or evasion. Immediate contact with authorities and the absence of flight are confirmed elements of the record. These behaviors align with a lack of perceived criminality at the time, a pattern commonly associated with severe psychosis. Again, this is descriptive, not exculpatory. From a legal standpoint, the outcome is also clear. After initial proceedings, the court ultimately determined that Andrea Yates was not criminally responsible by reason of insanity. She was committed to a mental health facility rather than sentenced to prison. That determination reflects the legal system's conclusion that her mental state at the time met a narrowly defined threshold. The diagnosis, the verdict, and the institutional response are matters of record. What lies beyond these points, however, is interpretive space, and that space must be treated carefully. We can observe patterns of cognitive rigidity, moral absolutism, and belief-driven reasoning. We can note how these patterns are consistent with documented features of postpartum psychosis. We can analyze how belief systems may have interacted with illness, and how family and institutional responses shaped the environment in which deterioration occurred. But these remain interpretations. We do not know the precise content of Andrea Yates's thoughts at specific moments. We cannot identify the exact point at which reality testing failed, or when certain beliefs became fixed. We cannot reconstruct internal deliberation with certainty. Beyond this point, certainty ends. This boundary is not a flaw in analysis, it is its ethical limit. To claim more would be to substitute narrative satisfaction for evidentiary support. It is also important to distinguish understanding from explanation. Understanding involves mapping relationships, illness, and identity, belief, and cognition, system and response. Explanation in its strongest form would require access to subjective experience that no record can provide. The former is possible, the latter is not. This distinction matters because it protects the analysis from moral overreach. It prevents us from transforming tragedy into a case study with a clean conclusion, and it resists the impulse to reduce complex human collapse into a single cause. What we can say with confidence is that this case reveals a convergence of severe mental illness, of rigid moral reasoning, of family fatigue, of medical and legal systems designed for intervention, not foresight. Each element is documented. Each is incomplete on its own. Together they form a pattern, not of inevitability, but of vulnerability. This is where careful analysis finds its value, not in solving the case beyond what the courts have already decided, not in assigning additional blame or extracting moral absolution, but in clarifying the limits of what can be known and the risks of assuming more. This case does not offer comfort in resolution. What it offers instead is a clearer view of how fragile judgment can become when illness, belief, responsibility, and institutional constraint intersect over time. That understanding does not close the story. It leaves it open honestly and deliberately. As this analysis reaches its final chapter, it does not arrive at a solution, it arrives at a boundary. There are aspects of this case that we will never know, not because they were hidden, but because they were never accessible in the first place. The most significant of these is the exact internal reasoning of Andrea Yates at critical moments. We do not know the precise sequence of thoughts that unfolded. We cannot identify the specific belief that crystallized last or the moment when doubt, if it existed at all, disappeared. We will also never know the precise moment of cognitive break. Mental illness rarely announces a clear dividing line between stability and collapse. There is no timestamp when reality testing switches off. Instead, deterioration often occurs through accumulation, beliefs, narrowing interpretations, hardening alternatives, quietly losing credibility. By the time the break is visible from the outside, it may already be complete on the inside. These uncertainties are not oversights, they are intrinsic limits. True crime narratives often promise clarity, a motive uncovered, a turning point, identified, a final truth revealed. This case resists that structure, not because the investigation was insufficient, but because the human mind does not always leave a traceable path. The record is silent, where inner experience begins. For the listener, this silence can be uncomfortable. There is a natural desire to resolve tension, to locate meaning in causation, to believe that understanding leads to prevention. But discomfort in this context serves an ethical purpose. Discomfort resists simplification. It prevents us from collapsing complexity into slogans or moral shortcuts. It forces us to sit with ambiguity rather than smoothing it over, and it reminds us that some questions persist, not because they are poorly asked, but because they exceed the tools available to answer them. This is why unresolved cases still matter. They matter not as puzzles left unfinished, but as reflections of structural and psychological limits. They reveal where systems end, where documentation fails, and where human experience becomes inaccessible to analysis. In doing so, they caution against overconfidence both in institutions and in narrative certainty. In this case, the absence of a definitive internal explanation does not negate what has been learned. It sharpens it. We have seen how severe mental illness can distort moral reasoning rather than erase it. How belief systems can interact with vulnerability, shaping perception without originating it. How families and professionals can act in good faith within systems that are not designed for long-term foresight. And how legal frameworks built for clarity struggle when reality itself becomes unstable. These insights remain valuable precisely because they are incomplete. They do not offer comfort, they offer perspective. As listeners, we are often trained to expect resolution as the reward for attention. But some stories ask something different. They ask for patience, for humility, for an acceptance that understanding does not always culminate in answers, and that analysis does not always lead to closure. Some cases resist narrative closure. They remain open not because something is missing, but because the truth they contain is fragmentary by nature. Human judgment under layered pressure can fracture in ways that leave no clean explanation behind. In those moments, the role of analysis is not to force coherence where none exists. It is to clarify what can be known, acknowledge what cannot, and respect the boundary between the two. Understanding is sometimes the only form of resolution available, and in cases like this one, that understanding, careful, restrained, and incomplete, may be the most honest ending we can offer.